Welcome to our podcast. We are excited to have you along for this journey. My name is Madison, and I'm the Executive Director of Peace Restored. I'll be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast, Seeking Healing, Finding Hope, which is a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. Today, I have Rebekah Gilmore joining us in the studio to continue our conversation on boundaries. Becca is on staff with us here at Peace Restored on our care team. She provides one-on-one care and is a group facilitator and is currently attending Liberty University pursuing her degree in counseling. Welcome back to the podcast studio, Becca.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we have been covering a lot of ground with boundaries over the last several weeks. And at the time of this podcast, we've had many of those that have been released. The last time that we were in the studio together, we were talking a little bit on the area of self-boundaries. And would you like to expand on that and give a little bit of a recap for our audience?
Yeah, so we started talking about the out-of-control soul last time that we met. And pretty much the basis of that is all healthy, fulfilled, happy people have something called self-control. So we started just talking about things we might struggle with, setting those boundaries with ourselves in the areas of food, healthy limits there, turning to food for comfort and other things. We talked about money, so like impulse spending, not having boundaries there, and then time as well. People struggling to have deadlines and meeting them and always running late, for example. So those three were the first three that we talked about last time.
So today we're going to kind of continue that conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about task completion. And some people might be thinking, well, okay, that's an interesting topic when we think about boundaries, because I think a lot of people, at least when I think of task, I think of checklist. You know, like, what are my things? And I think most people who are kind of a task completer, somebody who enjoys that, that's something like, oh, I have no problem. I love task completion.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly, I mean, that's part of what this is about, but not exactly.
Yeah.
And so we're going to kind of we're going to talk a little bit more and expand more on that topic of task completion. But can you give a little bit of maybe expansion on that topic of task completion? What does that mean? And what will we be talking about today?
Yeah, so for task completion, there's the idea that you might take on too many things. Your checklist that you talked about might really grow. You have a problem saying no to other people. And so you say yes to so many things. And therefore, you end up not being able to finish a task well. And so although you might be able to check off some things, are you doing it well, or are you rushing through it? And that's just the beginning of it.
Right. So, so it sounds almost like that person could get very overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Because they just, like, they don't have their best yes. They're saying yes to everything. And so instead of limiting and be able to say, no, I really can't go, or I don't have capacity to do that, they say yes to everything. And so they do everything kind of at a, maybe not the level that they really could do it at.
Yeah.
And so that could be a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think about, people I've known that do that say yes to absolutely everything. I had somebody I used to work with, and we would talk about saying, being able to say no, and that was a really big challenge for them. And it would came to a point where we just talked about, we would make a button to where they could just wear like almost like a sticker to where somebody was asked them, they could just say no, because it felt very personal to say no, like you were
letting somebody down.
Yes. And that can be really hard, because especially if we have people pleasing tendencies, or there's just just if you're just a natural caretaker, you want to be able to get into that space and help them out. And so saying no can feel
like maybe you're bad. You're a bad person if you can't.
But if you've been listening to our podcast, hopefully you've heard us say that no is a complete sentence. And so you don't have to give anybody more than just no. I don't have the capacity, if you want to say that, or just no, I can't. And if you're struggling with the guilt or shame that comes with saying no, that's when you maybe need to process through that with somebody else and say, okay, why can't I just say no?
Yeah, where are those feelings of guilt coming from?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because it causes a whole spiraling effect over time.
Yeah.
So, so when we aren't able to finish well, there's some problems that come up when we can't finish well.
Yeah.
And so we have several of those listed. Let's go ahead and start talking through some of those different problems that come up with unable to finish well.
Yeah. Well, the first one that comes to mind is resistance to structure. So sometimes people might feel like submitting to the discipline of a plan set in place is kind of a put down on them or cramping their style, you could say. And they kind of want more of that freedom to do it how they want. And then there might be the fear of success I've thought of too, being over concerned that your success or completing things very well might cause others to look bad, or they might criticize you. And so they might, what's the word? They might achieve or underachieve in order to not lose their friendships.
Yeah. So they're just trying to it's almost like they're trying to keep the peace.
Yeah.
It sounds like what do I have to do to keep us in relationship so that way we can continue forward. So so that could.
Which is interesting because I feel like these people, being people pleasers, they want to do their job well. They want people they like the feeling of being needed and depended on, but at the same time, they don't want to make anybody else look bad.
Yeah.
And so I just imagine there being like a push and pull.
Yeah. So that push pull, like I need you, but go away. I need you and go away kind of thing.
Yeah. And then another one would be lack of follow through. So having, they're more excited about coming up with the idea to do a project, birthing the idea, being creative in the beginning, but then the actual follow through might be hard when push comes to shove and you have to really do the boring, mundane task to get it done every day.
So that can be a big challenge for many, is that idea of the tedious, sometimes we look at the task or the activities we do and we're wanting to just focus on the things that are kind of like the big shiny object, if you will, like the thing that gets the most excitement. And if it's not exciting, then it's hard to follow through. And so I'm just going to ignore them or pretend like they're not there, avoid them, whatever.
Yeah.
So that way I can do the thing that's more exciting and stimulating.
Yeah. I think of the person that gets super excited, is super passionate about the idea, gets all these people involved and excited too. And then, you're in the project for a couple of weeks and by the end of it, they kind of just check out.
Yeah. You're like, oh, I thought we were doing something. But no, because the excitement wore off.
Yeah.
They've moved on to the next exciting thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. Then that kind of leads into the distractibility even, right? So they can be somebody can be pretty distracted.
Yeah. And so you can get excited about multiple things at once, starting multiple ideas and plans all at once, but without really the focus and the follow through for any of them, really. Or you put the responsibility on somebody else.
Yeah. So you're kind of being distracted from one thing to another. And then your responsibility or lack of responsibility, if you will, then transfers over to the other people.
Yeah.
Because you don't have a good boundary to say, this is my responsibility, it's something I need to keep on.
Yeah.
But instead, you're just bringing people around. I can only imagine how that's feeling to those around that person who is highly distractible.
Yeah, I can imagine some resentment grows there.
Yeah.
And then at some point, do you want to trust in their excitement over the next new project?
Yes, right. Right, because you're going to be left to pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we can all have tendencies where we can go into seasons in doing this distractibility, because maybe we've had some type of major crisis or an emergency arise, and sometimes when those things happen, we can become feels very distracting.
Yeah.
And so we can be taken off of task. So we have to, I think it's important for our listeners to kind of distinguish between, am I in the distractibility because of my extenuating circumstances, or is it a pattern of my behavior?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
It's something that's like the book talks about in earlier chapters, the knapsack versus the boulders. And if you're experiencing boulders in your life or something's overpowering and overweighing on your shoulders, that you need help, to just try to be aware of that and to know not to say yes to all of the projects if you're already under that pressure that you need help.
Yeah. And so it's a good reminder, right, that we need to distinguish, are we in a boulder or knapsack dynamic? And if we do feel like those boulders are pushing in, sometimes often it's better for us to kind of step back and say, this is when I need help.
Yeah.
That we can cry kind of like mercy. I need my people to come around me.
Yeah.
I need to limit what I'm able to do. And that's setting a good and healthy boundary.
Yeah.
Well, often we're talking about in our podcast when you and I have been discussing is the lack of, or the area in which we don't have boundaries, but trying to look at the opposite side and say, where can we insert good and healthy boundaries, I think is important as we're growing through this and learning together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we've been talking about task completion and really thinking through how either the inability to complete tasks, maybe resistance, fear, we've talked about lack of follow through, being distracted. There's so many nuances to task completion. But it's really important for us to recognize if that is an area that we have some challenges for boundaries. And if it is, how can we work through that and set up good and appropriate boundaries for ourselves as we're learning to navigate that? Because if not, if we continue in those spaces, those around us aren't going to enjoy our presence as much.
No, might not stick around.
They might not. Or you might be in a space where you feel this constant friction or tension. Like, why is everybody always stressed when they're around me?
Yeah.
Well, there might be a reason, right? So you might need to do some self-evaluation, because if this is a space you're in often, then maybe there's some things you need to address so that way you're not inadvertently pushing your boundaries pushing your responsibilities, thank you, onto others. So that way we can accidentally do a disservice to those around us by not having good and healthy boundaries. So the next area we're going to talk about is our words. And our words, that can be a really loaded topic.
Yeah.
Because, that's what we use on a daily basis. We use our words to communicate. And sometimes we use our words as weapons.
Yeah, we don't think about how powerful our words can be to somebody, whether they're good or bad. They still have such a power behind them.
Yeah.
And for this topic, when somebody might have a hard time being responsible over their words, I think of people that might hold the floor for a long time. They talk in ways of going off on tangents. Nobody can get a word in. They change subjects really fast.
Yeah.
Or they might spend too much time on irrelevant details, never getting to the point, pretty much.
Yeah.
And I think all of us has met somebody like that.
Yes. Yeah. So it's almost like they just want to continue. A lot of times I think when people are in that space, they're wanting to be heard.
Yeah.
But that still doesn't make it okay. Right. Because there has to be a limit to what we do. Everything we can't always be the center.
Yeah.
I don't think you can always be the center of attention. I don't think you should. And so it's important for us to be able to know what our limit is, because it's not wrong to share your thoughts and opinions, and maybe kind of, as an old saying goes, is be on your soapbox for a couple of minutes. And sometimes we need to have that platform to be able to share. But if we stay on our soapbox, right, it can be something that doesn't invite people into our space.
Yeah. And I think about the reason why somebody might do this as well. And I think it stems from the fear that the people might leave them. And so they might try to keep them as long as they can.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's a really hard thing to try to figure out if that's what you're dealing with.
Yeah, I'm thinking about somebody who I've been in a relationship with, and that has had these tendencies that we're talking about. And I'm trying to think, when they would fall into this pattern, it would be often, I'm thinking, because they wanted to be heard. They wanted people to stay around them. They wanted they wanted to be validated for what they were feeling and thought.
Yeah.
And I remember that as I'm reflecting on this person would, if they weren't recognized, they'd get louder, and they would get louder or make themselves bigger somehow.
Yeah.
So that way, people would hear them. But in essence, what I observed of the years of knowing this person is that when that behavior would get bigger, it would ultimately push those around them away.
Yeah.
It didn't bring them in. They would go, oh, yeah, I've had enough. Or it caused distrust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think about how hard it would be on the other side of it, just feeling that sense of panic, like you have to get bigger because you're almost anticipating them leaving.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's hard.
Yeah, it is. It's super hard when you're feeling unheard, because you just want people to hear you. And if you don't know how to do that well, you try to use the tools that you have. And if the tools you have aren't healthy, it causes an unhealthy balance.
Yeah.
So how we use our language and kind of like we're talking about, our language, our mannerisms, the way we interact, our words can really affect the quality of that relationship with everybody that we interact with.
Mm-hmm.
So,
so your words can be kind of like we just mentioned earlier, a source of blessing or a curse to somebody.
Yes. When we want our words to be blessings, and by being a blessing, we can encourage others. We can even be confronting, which some people might think of confronting as not a blessing, but it really is. If we can go to someone and say, listen, because of this, it's affected me this way.
Yeah, if you can get through that conflict resolution, it actually increases your intimacy with somebody.
It does. It feels at the beginning, right? Like it is, confrontation can feel like, as we're using the word curse, it can feel like a curse or something negative. But the opposite is actually true. When we allow that conflict to sit out there, it causes deeper rooted conflict, even though it's unspoken. It causes a division in the relationship, whether it's your a family relationship, a friend, even a professional relationship. Any of those can be affected by a lack of conflict resolution. Here at Peace Restored, we have a high view on conflict resolution. It's something, especially as mental health providers and believers, we want to come together. We want to resolve conflict. So we have a policy on how do we resolve conflict.
Yeah.
It's not always comfortable, but we need to do it, because if we don't, we know it's going to affect our relationships here at the office. So, but we can also, through our words, we can have great empathy for others.
Yeah.
We can encourage. We can really connect with people.
Yeah.
So, like you said in the beginning, our words can be so powerful.
Absolutely.
But there's always the opposite, right? So, with great power can be a positive, but it can also be a negative.
Yeah, it can build up, it can destroy something. So some examples of that negative side that you can use your words would be kind of like that scenario we talked about in the beginning, somebody talking nonstop, which coincidentally pushes somebody away, which is pretty much that person hiding from the intimacy that you can gain through conversation. That person can dominate conversations to control others. Of course, there's gossip. That's a big one. Making sarcastic remarks, which is, I think, another big one. Some people might think being sarcastic is comical or being funny, but you don't know how the other person's going to take it.
Yeah.
And so unless you have that relationship with them, that banter can accidentally hurt somebody.
It can. Yeah. And I think like you were saying, you have to know a person's personality to know if you can have kind of that sarcastic bantering back and forth. I remember one time there was somebody I was in a relationship with, and their personality did not receive sarcasm well, and I didn't know that. And for them, every time I was sarcastic, because I can have some sarcastic nature to myself, and I would do that bantering, and they took it not as banter, but as literal.
Yeah.
And so to them, it was hurtful. And so when I learned that about them, I corrected my behavior, and I had to learn how to interact differently with them, because if not, that relationship wouldn't have been able to continue, because it was very challenging for them to hear sarcasm.
Yeah. I think being the person giving the sarcasm, you might think that it's obvious what the message being sent is. But if somebody hasn't grown up in an atmosphere where sarcasm was everywhere, you're going to have that person that reads into it as literal and be like, well, I just took it as what you said, as what you meant.
Right,
you know?
right.
And yeah, it can be hard.
Yeah, it can be. So we do have to be careful how we use our words. I think you also mentioned in that same thread of gossip. I think especially in our culture today with social media and everything that we have available at our fingertips, it's made it so much easier to, and I don't think in our normal everyday conversation, we wouldn't call it gossip.
Yeah, it's almost turned into just a way of life. It's accepted, and it's easy to just put something out on social media and not have to bear the consequences of it.
Yeah.
And it's almost praised.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, I think of many of the pages online where you can just go on and you can see people talking about somebody in the community, or talking about a business, or just all kinds of things we can see, and it's readily right there. Or just somebody who just posts about their family on public pages. And I understand why a lot of times people do that, is to vent. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is kind of the person's making themselves big because they want to be heard, and they want, they've been either hurt or wounded somehow a lot of times, and they're wanting to get their voice out there. But it does ultimately come back to using our words inappropriately and gossiping or sharing information that's not ours to share.
Yeah.
And we have to be really careful, because not every story is ours to share.
Yeah. And if you need a vent, that's one thing, I think. And I think it's okay with a safe person, or with somebody that you know. It's not broadcasting it.
Right.
You're doing it in a safe place with somebody.
Yeah. I think about, I agree. Like, we need to find a safe person to do that with. But in my mind, I was thinking about how, and sometimes in the church dynamic and the church world, will use Christianese to gossip, if you will, and somebody will raise their hand, or in a group setting, they'll share a prayer request about a friend.
Yeah.
But they haven't been given permission to share that.
Oh, yes.
And so you are gossiping.
Yeah. Even if you put a pretty bow around it.
Right.
As a prayer, that's still overstepping a boundary, sharing information that wasn't yours to share.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that, right? Is it your story to share?
Yeah.
Have you been given the freedom to share it because it's somebody else's story? And if you haven't, even if you put a pretty bow around it, put it in a box, whatever you want to do, it's not yours to give. It's not yours to share. So it therefore becomes gossip.
Yeah.
And when we do that, we cause wounding, we cause hurting of others, and we break those relationships. And so we have to be so careful. Our words, as we've said several times, matter. Another thing that can happen with our words is we can use them as a threat.
Yeah. You can threat somebody to get what you want.
Yeah.
You can seduce or manipulate somebody. You can give the silent treatment, withholding words to punish them, form of manipulation. Or you can massage the truth in order to just look better for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we kind of go on the edges of what's true and just like, we just might make it, or what do we call it? White lies. Like use some, like they're just a white lie. It's just small. It really isn't going to hurt anybody. I'm just going to soften the truth.
Yeah, until later somebody finds out the full extent of the story and then you become discredited.
Right.
You know?
Like they're like, well, what do you mean? I thought you were.
You made it sound like this.
Yeah, but it was really only like, oh, and so it, before we know it, we can end up just causing so much harm with our words.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to know that we have to set good and healthy boundaries. We have to know what's ours to share, what's not ours to share, how to speak in truth.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be truthful and honest and forthright. And when we don't do those things and we use our words as a means to control or manipulate others, it does cause a break in relationship. Whether the person that we're in relationship with acknowledges it or not initially, they may not verbalize, man, that hurt. But what you're going to see is there's going to be a change in the way they respond to you.
Yeah.
May not be the first time that you do it, but if you do it more than once, it's going to affect the way they respond. So often when we have problems with our words and setting those boundaries, or as it's put in the boundaries book, the verbal boundaries or verbal limitations, often the people who have those struggles, they aren't even aware that they're there.
Yeah, and it's hard if you try to point something out to somebody that can cause their defenses to go up. Yeah.
And so they're like, I don't have a problem. You got a problem, right? And it's like, and so in that situation, we have to be able to pull away and let them sit in that, because they need to feel their own tension and be able to feel that there's something not right. We don't have to necessarily fix it, but we have to give them the space to process through that.
Yeah.
As we're wrapping up our discussion today, we've been talking about boundaries and limitations with our words, and then also with our task, or maybe our lack of ability to get tasks completed, right?
Yeah.
And so as we think about those two things, those two areas really encompass a lot of our day-to-day life. Yeah.
Everywhere.
Every
second.
Yeah. We can't get away from our words, right? We can't get away from either tasks, the lack of, or the overextension of our tasks that we're doing. So all of those things are day to day.
Yeah. If we're going to live life well, there's, you can't escape having to complete tasks.
Right. You can't.
Yeah. They're everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, that's another whole conversation, right? If we're avoiding them completely, but it's impossible. And it's impossible to get away from how to use our words well. And so I think today was a good conversation to help us really step into that space of, what does it look like to have a healthy boundary with our words? What does it look like to have a healthy boundary with the tasks that we're doing, the activities we're doing day to day, and how do these things impact others?
Yeah.
So I think for our listeners, as they're thinking through these two areas, I would encourage them to kind of just step back and think, where do I need to work on my words? Are there times that I use my words as weapons?
Yeah.
If you were working with somebody on these two topics, what would be some good questions you would ask them to think about?
I would probably say to look at the relationships in your lives and to see how people respond to you. To see if there's trust in your ability to complete a task. To ask yourself what level of accomplishment or how you feel you do when you complete a task, maybe.
Yes, I'm a believer of, it's so good for you to stop and reflect and ask yourself good questions.
Yeah.
So we've given some good questions to challenge our audience with, but they might come up with other ones. So maybe this would be a good time for you to get out your journal and just start writing down, like, what are some areas that I struggle with and boundaries, especially with words and task management. How can I navigate through this differently?
Yeah.
How can I are there people that's impacted by my lack of boundaries?
Yeah.
Or am I impacted by others' lack of boundaries?
Yeah, and I just had that same thought too, is I know it can be hard to have control over your own words as well, when somebody else might not have control over their words.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to realize, well, you can't change that other person, but you can change your response, and you can change yourself no matter how they respond to you.
Yeah. We don't get to control others. We get to control ourselves and how we respond.
Yeah.
And that's such a good thing. And it's when we can learn that and learn how to implement that, it is actually very powerful, because it takes away the control others have over us.
Absolutely.
So, well, thanks for joining us today, Becca, in the podcast studio. This was fun to talk about boundaries again. It's always interesting as we have these conversations. So we have an outline that we're going through, but we aren't always quite sure where the conversation is going to take us. So I always enjoy that, to see where the conversation is going to take us. And today I think was a particularly good topic for us to delve into. For those of you listening, if you've missed any of our previous podcasts, we encourage you to go check them out. You can go to our website at peacerestored.net, and you can find all of our different podcasts there. Don't forget to check out our show notes, where you'll be able to find links and additional content and a few video links. As we wrap our discussion today, make sure to stay tuned as we continue to share with you practical ways where you too can seek healing and find hope. Join us in our next podcast, where we will continue to discuss mental health and faith. So come back next time for transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.